Have you ever been treated like a nuisance in the house you helped build with your own hands? Have you ever felt the weight of a silence that screams louder than any cruel word? I did. And it was that day, that cold morning, that everything inside me changed. Brian, my grandson, hugged me like he always did, with that practiced way, like someone trying to appear caring. He said he was going to take me to see a new place, for a walk, to clear my head. I accepted. After all, he was my grandson, the boy I raised as my son, the boy I rocked on feverish nights, the boy I defended at the school gate when no one believed in him, the same boy who, that day, left me alone at a bus station, with an old suitcase and a hastily folded note. Go back to your city, Grandma. Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just mine. It could be yours too. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hand and my heart heavy, as if I'd been beaten without hands. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just sat on the cold bench and tried to understand when love turns into rejection. Because, you see, we don't realize it all at once. Abandonment begins slowly. First with an impatient look, then with that phrase that sounds like a joke, "You're just a hindrance." Later comes the forgotten dates, the separated plate in the corner of the sink, the decision made without consulting you, and one day, you're at the bus station. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt like an outcast from your own family? I felt it firsthand. And on that bench, looking at my suitcase, which wasn't even mine, it was borrowed from my neighbor. I understood. No one abandons someone all at once. We're pushed to the margins, day after day, until there's no more room left. But I already had a plan. The moment I read that note, something inside me clicked. Because it wasn't just a story of abandonment. It was a story of silent overcoming, of resistance without fanfare. You'll understand how I realized it in time to protect myself and, most importantly, how I turned the tables without having to scream. I know there are a lot of people who will watch this and think, she should have fought back, made a fuss. But sometimes, the greatest strength lies in silence, in not begging, in not going back, in letting the other person feel the weight of the absence of someone who should never have been treated like leftovers. This is a true story, a story of a grandmother who refused to accept her role as deadweight, a burden, an old piece of furniture in a corner of the room, a woman who decided that being forgotten wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a new journey. And it was there, in that godforsaken place, that I began to write the most unexpected chapter of my life, a chapter no one in my family ever imagined I would be able to live. But I'll tell you about that later. I didn't take any buses that day. I sat down, took a deep breath, and began to remember who I was before they made me invisible. Because that's what they do to us, isn't it? They slowly erase us, until we doubt if there's any light left inside. But there, alone, at the bus station, was where I began to rekindle mine. And if you've ever felt forgotten, ignored, or treated like a nuisance by the people you've helped most, I invite you to share your story too. Leave a comment below with what touched or upset you so far. Sometimes, what's inside you needs to come out for air. And who knows, maybe your experience will help someone else going through something similar. If this kind of story makes you think, moves you, or reminds you of someone, like this video, it helps more than you can imagine. And if you want to continue following real stories of people who have cried a lot but also learned to rise up in silence, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this space grow. It's what makes this message reach other voices that haven't yet been heard. But make no mistake, this story is just beginning. Because at that moment, even with my eyes full, I still had a clear idea of what needed to be done. They thought they knew me. The kind grandmother, always ready to help, who smiles even when she's not seen, who doesn't complain when she's forgotten. Miss Ellie, the one who woke up before everyone else to leave the coffee warm on the table, who ironed her grandson's uniform shirt with the same care as someone smoothing a flag, the one who, even when tired, would say, "Leave it, I'll take care of it." And she really did. She cared like someone who understands that loving also means giving up. But the problem with loving so much is that, one day, you start to disappear into others. The truth is, no one notices when we start to disappear. They slowly push our limits, testing how far we'll go. And as we love, we go. We begin to nullify ourselves, silence ourselves, push ourselves aside, thinking this is being strong. But it's not. It's dangerous. Because there comes a time when we forget who we were before we were just support for others. And when we forget, They forget to dot. My house was the place where everyone felt welcome, until they stopped coming in, until Sunday lunches became silent, until birthdays were remembered only with a cold text message. Do you know what it's like to look at a cake and know no one will come? It's strange. It feels like you're on an empty stage, with all the backstage lights turned off, just the silence, the candle, and you. I began to notice the cracks in the structure I'd held together for so many years. Little things, the dish left unattended, the wet towel on the couch, the way Brian started calling me she instead of grandma, and that hurt me more than any scream. Because silent contempt hurts differently. It's a kind of abandonment that's silent but impactful. We feel it in our souls. I wasn't perfect, but if there's one thing I never lacked, it was presence. Presence when my daughter-in-law had her first child and I was the one who held her hand during the birth. Presence when Brian was afraid of the dark at 8. Presence when they wanted to travel and had no one to leave the children with. I was always there, all of me. And when I needed them, they left me with a suitcase and a message. But behind the apron lay an attentive mind. I heard conversations that weren't meant for me. I read the looks in their eyes, and I began to understand that the world I'd helped build was being taken from me, room by room, not out of overt malice, but out of a kind of emotional blindness. They thought I couldn't see, but I saw everything. I saw the contempt disguised as modernity, the disrespect disguised as independence, the coldness disguised as practicality. That's when I started saving evidence, yes, but also saving memories, small details that would make sense later, because sometimes the hidden truth lies precisely between the lines, in the gestures no one notices, and I knew that sooner or later they would notice what they had lost, not out of revenge, but out of absence, because of how much I would be missed. Without having said a word, my silence was strategic. It was the only space where I still had control. While they decided for me, I charted another path, a journey that wouldn't have their approval, but would have my truth. A decision made with the weight of everything I'd experienced and the lightness of knowing it was no longer my fault. They say it's behind the scenes of pain that the greatest transformations are born, and I was about to do something no one imagined. If any part of this story reminded you of something you've experienced or felt, write it in the comments below. I also saw everything in silence. They didn't decide to get rid of me overnight. It started long before the bus station, with small, casual phrases thrown around. You could get out of the house for a bit. We need more privacy. You're always in the middle of things. At first, I pretended it wasn't me. I'd smile, change the subject, offer a coffee. Because we always think that if we keep being helpful, if we keep being sweet, they'll realize our value. But they don't. They were too busy with their own routine, their own rush, their own bubble. And there I was, shrinking, squeezing myself to fit where there was no more space. I remember one afternoon hearing my daughter-in-law say, "She's slowing everything down. I can't live like this anymore." She was standing behind the door, a basket of laundry in her hand. I stood there, listening, as she explained to Brian how it would be better if I went away for a few days. "Just to clear my head," she said. But her tone was one of relief, not concern. And him. He nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to let go of someone who had been there for every important moment of his life. It's hard to describe what it feels like when someone you raised as a child starts planning your absence. It's not just sadness. It's a kind of emotional shock that scrambles everything inside. We try to find a justification. Maybe I was invasive. Maybe I'm just getting in the way. Our mind starts sabotaging its own story, trying to understand how love became so uncomfortable, but deep down, I knew it wasn't about me. It was about them, about their lack of awareness, about ingratitude masquerading as evolution. The day they took me to the bus station, they pretended it was a trip. Brian even tried to be friendly. He put my suitcase in the car and said it would be good for me to spend a few days in my hometown, that I would see old friends, get some rest. "You deserve some time for yourself, Grandma," he said. And there I was, looking at him like someone seeing a stranger wearing the face of someone they once loved. When we got there, he gave me a quick hug. He avoided eye contact. He opened the trunk, took out my suitcase, and placed it next to me. Then he handed me an envelope. "Read it later," he said, and he left, without looking back. The sound of the engine pulling away echoed in my head. mixed with the sound of people passing by, the wheels of the suitcase scraping on the dirty floor, the speakers announcing destinations that weren't mine. I sat on the bench and opened the envelope. It was just a note, a simple sheet of paper, with his hurried handwriting. "Go back to your town, Grandma. We need space." That was it. No signature, no "with love," no shame. I sat there, staring at that piece of paper like someone staring at a sentence. But instead of crying, I took a deep breath. I felt the air slowly come in and out, because, in that moment, in the midst of abandonment, I realized something I'd never felt before: freedom. Yes, it seemed contradictory, but perhaps for the first time, I owed no one anything. No one was expecting my lunch, my sewing, my stories. No one was counting on me being there, and that, in a twisted way, gave me back my own presence. It's strange when injustice has the power to push us into a decision we'd otherwise never have the courage to make. But there, sitting, listening to the world go by without me, I understood that that exclusion was also a liberation. It wasn't just abandonment. It was a push out of the cage I'd trapped myself in, trying to be indispensable. If you've ever felt this kind of silent pain, write here in the comments. It wasn't about me. I didn't cry, not a single tear. I just calmly sealed the envelope and put it in my bag, like someone filing away evidence, not a goodbye. I got up from the bench with my suitcase beside me and walked to the nearest water fountain. I was thirsty, but more than that, I was hungry for a kind of clarity I'd never felt before. It was as if, in that moment, I'd begun to see life from a different perspective, not that of the victim, but that of the perpetrator. And I'd decided, right then and there, that the next page of this story wouldn't be written by them. It would be mine. It was a silent moment, but inside me, the noise was of a world crumbling and another being born, as if what was left of me was finally organizing itself into a purposeful form. I didn't know exactly where I would go from there, but I knew with absolute certainty where I wouldn't return. I wouldn't return home as someone who accepts being tolerated. I wouldn't return to the role of the grandmother who needs to ask permission to exist. And I wouldn't return to any place where love needed to justify itself constantly. What many would call abandonment, in that moment, became my starting point, because when your entire structure is ripped away, that's when you discover the hidden truth. What's left is exactly what you needed to see to know who you truly are. And I saw it. I saw a woman who had lived long enough to accept no less than she deserved. I saw strength that time could not erase. I saw dignity. And I saw freedom. Even if at first it tasted like rejection, I shifted the weight of my bag from one shoulder to the other and took a deep breath. It wasn't just a physical issue, it was symbolic. Every step I took on that cold bus station floor was a step away from the place they'd placed me. And this shift in mindset, subtle as it may seem, was what changed everything. Because when we start walking with our own decisions instead of others' expectations, something inside us, REALIGNS. My whole life, I've followed a logic I was taught. Be good, be discreet, be useful. And I did until it hurt. I did until I was annihilated. But no one taught me what to do. After all, that was no longer enough. And in that moment, sitting on a bench at a forgotten station, it was as if the answer had arrived without me, asking, do what they never told you was allowed. Choose yourself. I chose myself. For the first time in a long time, I did so. And it wasn't out of pride, nor revenge. It was for emotional health, out of respect for my own story. Because I deserved more than being a backdrop in the script of other people's lives. And if there was no longer room for me on that stage, that was fine. I would write another script. Behind the scenes, I understood, and this time, the show would be mine. With my suitcase by my side and my soul lighter than ever, I began to imagine the possibilities. Not fantasies, but plans. Nothing grand. Something simple, but full of truth. Because when you lose everything you thought you had, that's when you find what truly matters. And I had something precious. Time. Time to start over. To reinvent myself. To show, not to them, but to myself, that there was still much of the Ellie I'd always been. It was just dormant. And there, in that bus station, without a farewell party, without an audience, and without applause, began what I call my second birth, a silent beginning, but as powerful as a scream. And with each passing minute, I understood that this rebirth would have consequences. Because when we awaken, the world around us feels it. If you've ever had that moment when everything turned around, write here in the comments. I chose myself that the first thing I did was turn off my phone, not out of anger, but out of necessity. It was as if the digital silence helped me hear my own voice better. The voice that had been muffled for years by obligations, demands, and expectations. I walked to an old-fashioned coffee shop nearby, the kind that still serves cake on a napkin and freshly brewed coffee. I sat at a corner table and ordered a cheese bread. It was simple, but in that moment, it was a gesture of autonomy. Choosing what to eat, where to sit, where to go, it seemed basic. But for me, after years of living for others, it was revolutionary. I opened the old diary I carried in my purse. It wasn't digital. It was one of those paper ones, with folded corners and hastily scribbled notes. I leafed through it until I found her name, Sylvia, a former nursing colleague, one of those friendships that endures even when life separates your paths. I called. Her voice answered with surprise and affection. I didn't need to explain much. I just said, I need to start over. And she understood, maybe because she, too, knew what it was like to be ripped away from a place where you'd invested too much love. Within a few days, I was staying at her house. Simple, welcoming, smelling of rosemary and fresh coffee. It was there that what I call my secret plan was born. It wasn't a plan for revenge, nor to show anyone how capable I was. It was about me, about rebuilding my identity beyond the roles assigned to me. Mother, grandmother, caregiver. For the first time, I was writing my story without the burden of pleasing others. Sylvia introduced me to an online course on natural therapies. She knew that, even in retirement, my caregiving soul never slept. I'd always loved teas, oils, massages, and grandma's remedies. She said, make this your own, Ellie, something you offer, but without negating yourself. I listened, and I dove in. I began studying with the same dedication I once reserved for caring for others. With each class, I felt something inside me rebuild, as if the roots that had been dry began to revive. And it was during one of those late-night studies that the idea emerged. A channel, a space to share what I knew, what I felt, what I had experienced, not as an expert, but as a woman, as an elderly woman who still has much to say, as someone who was discarded but chose to flourish. Sylvia loved the idea. She helped me with the camera, the microphone, and the first videos. We recorded in the backyard, with birdsong in the background. I talked about anxiety, insomnia, and body aches, but I also talked about loss, about transformation, about rediscovering one's own strength. The most curious thing was seeing how people began to connect. Comments from women who said, "You said what I never could." Men who remembered their own mothers, young people who discovered in me a wisdom their homes didn't offer. And there, in that corner of the internet, I found something I no longer expected to find: belonging. I realized that when you share your pain truthfully, it becomes a bridge, and many people are looking for bridges. Between loneliness and a new beginning, between abandonment and reinvention. I didn't expect to be seen again, but I was, and, more than that, I was heard. The journey was just beginning, but something inside me already knew that this version of Ellie would never return to the shadows. She had allowed herself to live, and there was no going back after that. If you've also done something quietly powerful for yourself, write in the comments. I started again, in secret. Sometime later, I felt something still needed healing. It wasn't recent. It didn't come from Brian, nor the bus station, nor the ticket. It was older, like a forgotten root, buried so deep that sometimes we even forget it exists, until a new cycle begins and it hurts again. It was the past. The kind of past we don't post in photos, don't talk about at family dinners, but it shapes everything we are. I took a bus back to the place where it all began. It wasn't a nostalgic trip. It was a necessary visit. The orphanage still existed. It had changed its name, but the gates, the peeling brick facade, and the smell of disinfectant in the hallway were still there. My footsteps echoed differently on that floor, now that I walked with more awareness. Walking there was like stepping inside a version of myself that still screamed for recognition. That girl with the messy braids, who shared a bed with 3 others, who ate in silence and dreamed of being chosen by someone. That girl still lived inside me, hidden beneath all the layers of resilience I'd built throughout my life. I stopped in front of the door to the old sewing room. It was there that I learned to hem, to mend, to create with what little I had. That room was my refuge and, at the same time, my training for a life where I would always be the one adjusting, repairing, holding the line. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe a lifetime. I felt a lump in my throat, but I didn't cry. I just gave silent thanks. Sometimes, pain teaches more than affection, and I had learned a lot. Spoke with the current coordinator. She didn't recognize me, but she listened attentively as I told her who I was. I spoke of the days when I felt invisible, of forgotten birthdays, of the long punishments for crying at night. And, mid-conversation, I realized that something inside me no longer hurt the same way. It was as if that visit, that reunion with the girl I once was, brought me face to face with the whole Ellie, not just the woman who suffered, but the one who survived, who rose from every fall, who turned her loss into strength. I left an anonymous donation there. Books, blankets, some kits with teas and oils that I prepared myself, not because I wanted to be remembered, but because now I could truly give without having to annul myself in the process. And perhaps those children, those quiet girls like I was, needed a little comfort amidst the cold routine of rules and silences. I left feeling light. For the first time in decades, I felt as if I had made peace with my history. That I wasn't just made of the scars that marked me, but also of the decisions I made after them. I wasn't just the forgotten girl, nor just the discarded grandmother. I was someone who built her own dignity, brick by brick, without applause or an audience. When I returned to Sylvia's house that night, I sat in the backyard with a cup of chamomile tea. I looked up at the sky, full of tiny stars, and thought about how much everything had changed and how, perhaps, it had all been inside me all along. It just needed silence and space to emerge. That the Ellie born at that bus station hadn't just rediscovered the world, she'd rediscovered herself. And no one could take that away. If this part of my journey spoke to something that lives inside you too, right here in the comments, I found who I was again. That night, sitting in the backyard with the still warm cup in my hands, I realized that my story, even filled with silences, could no longer be kept hidden within me. It was as if each chapter I'd lived from the earliest pain to the most unlikely new beginning had something to offer those on the other side of the screen who had also felt forgotten, ignored, or erased. I didn't have all the answers. I still don't. But I know that when we share what hurt, what changed, and what still pulsates, we are no longer alone. So, if anything in this story has ever revolted you, or reminded you of something you've experienced, leave a comment below with what touched you most. Sometimes, writing is a way to breathe deeper, and your voice here can be a bridge for someone who needs to feel less alone. If you've been experiencing this silent struggle, if this story has found a place within you, enjoy this video. It shows that it's worth continuing, that it's worth bringing to light what many people still hide. And if you want to follow me on this journey, which isn't just mine, but that of so many strong, silent, and vibrant women's, subscribe to the channel. It's your presence here that makes all this grow, reach more hearts, and show that real stories have the power to transform. Because, in the end, there are many of us living inside what the world doesn't see on the outside, and we deserve to be heard. And in that silent dawn, with the sky as clear as my conscience, I understood. My story was just beginning to be told in the right way. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that begins with the smell of coffee and a sliver of sunlight streaming through the curtains, when the phone rang. The number was familiar. I glanced at the display, and for a moment, my heart skipped a beat, but didn't race. The Ellie who had flinched at every gesture from her family was gone. I answered calmly. On the other end, Brian's voice was different. It wasn't arrogant or impatient. It was hesitant, almost shy. He began by asking how I was, barely concealing his discomfort at doing something that was clearly no longer part of his routine. He talked about his kids. He said the company he worked for had closed contracts, his income had plummeted, and his wife was overwhelmed. He spoke quickly, hurriedly, as if trying to justify himself before asking. And then came the line I knew was coming. Could you keep the kids for a few days, just until we get organized? It's funny how life takes turns. A while ago, this request would have sent me rushing to their house, preparing the children's favorite snacks, tidying their rooms, and organizing my life as I'd done so many times, without being asked. But there, in that moment, the request echoed what I'd experienced. A belated reflection of what life exacts when someone cultivates neglect for too long. I didn't answer right away. I took a deep breath. I let the silence do its work. Sometimes, silence is the best mirror. Brian remained silent on the other end. I think, deep down, he already knew what my answer would be, or at least, what it would truly entail. When I spoke, my voice was calm but firm. Now, do you understand what it's like to be left alone, Brian? It wasn't said with anger, nor with revenge. It was simply an acknowledgement, like holding a mirror up to someone else and only showing the reflection. There was a pause, the kind that weighs more heavily than any scream. And then he said, almost in a whisper, "I'm sorry." For the first time in a long time, he apologized. But even that wasn't enough to erase what had been done, and I didn't need it to be either, because forgiveness, sometimes, isn't a return, it's a full stop. And that day, I understood that forgiving didn't mean going back. I explained that my life was different now, that I couldn't and didn't want to return to that role of silent support, that I was busy with my projects, my services, my time. I spoke respectfully, but without leaving room for doubt. I was no longer accessible in the way I'd allowed myself to be before, and that was okay. It was fair. After I hung up, I sat in my usual spot in the backyard, teacup in hand, the sky open above me. I thought about how much this journey has shaped me, how it took losing everything to finally see myself completely. The hidden truth is that life always shows us what needs to be seen, but we're not always ready to see it, until one day, we're placed before the mirror we've avoided for years. And then there's no denying it. That morning, with the sun warming my feet and the sound of birds filling the silence, I felt peace. A peace that didn't come because everything was resolved, but because I had finally come to terms with myself. Divine justice, sometimes, isn't about the other person paying. It's about you no longer having to demand it. If you've ever experienced a moment when silence spoke for you, write here in the comments. I saw the reflection. The distance didn't come as punishment, it came as a consequence. A silent harvest of what had been sown for years. And as harsh as it may sound, the truth is that not every absence is loss. Sometimes, it's protection. It was living away from Brian that I realized how much my life could flourish without the burden of trying to be accepted by those who never wanted to see me fully. The love didn't disappear, but the attachment that yes, I learned to let go of. Little by little, my routine transformed into something that made sense to me. Waking up on time, tending to the plants, recording videos with my hair tied up in a mess and a light heart, eating lunch slowly, writing down my most hidden memories in an old notebook. Small things, but full of meaning. Things that, for so long, I'd put off, waiting for someone to need me. And when that someone finally disappeared, I realized it was with myself that I should have started. The people who began to surround me in this new cycle were different. They weren't there out of obligation or convenience. They listened to me. They asked me how I was, and waited for the answer. They valued every recipe I taught, every piece of advice I gave, every story I told. And this, however small it may seem, reminded me of something I had long forgotten. I was still relevant, not because of what I did for others, but because of who I was. The journey wasn't easy, but it was fair. It required firm choices, painful decisions, and a change in mindset that only came after the impact. Because abandonment, when you survive it, has the power to reposition you at the center of your own existence. And that's exactly what happened. I stopped waiting to be called and started inviting myself into the life I wanted to live. And that changed everything. And Brian, he followed his path. He sent me a few messages over the months, short attempts, full of half apologies and timid invitations. I responded politely, with the same serenity with which you speak to someone who no longer lives within you. Because I forgave, but returning to the place where I was discarded, that would be a betrayal of myself. There was no scandal, no argument. There was only silence. A silence full of meaning, of response, of awareness. The kind of silence that doesn't shout, but teaches, that doesn't break, but restructures. And when we learn to live with this kind of silence, we understand that not every absence hurts, some heal. Today, when I look back, I see that the greatest lesson of this journey wasn't about rejection, but about rediscovery. Rediscovering myself, my strength, the woman who was always here, waiting for space to blossom. I didn't become hard or bitter. I became whole, and that's what scares most those who only knew how to deal with my half. Life doesn't demand things quickly, but it does. And the law of return doesn't have to be cruel to be fair. Sometimes, it only returns the exact space you gave to someone else, empty. And it was in this space that I built my freedom. If you've ever reaped peace where others expected you to reap sorrow, write here in the comments, the distance healed me. Freedom doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it arrives with the bitter taste of what we didn't want to lose, but were forced to leave behind. And that's exactly what I felt that night, sitting in the living room armchair, looking out the window as the wind slowly blew the curtains. There was no noise, only the sound of silence, itself a dense silence, full of memories, of voices that once filled the house, of laughter that faded with time. There, in that still moment, I understood that freedom also has a price, and, often, that price is loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of knowing that certain connections will never return. I didn't want distance. I never did. What I wanted was respect, a thoughtful look, a sincere gesture, a space where I could exist fully, without needing to mold myself into someone else's mold. But when love becomes an obligation, when affection becomes a task, the best thing we can do for ourselves is to leave slowly and close the door from the inside. And that's what I did. I didn't slam the door. I didn't leave a message. I didn't make a sound. I just went. And what I found on the other side wasn't an explosion of happiness, but a strange calm, one that became familiar over time. There are days when I still stare at my phone, waiting for a message that never arrives. Other times, I pass a child at the grocery store and remember my grandchildren. The longing doesn't go away. It learns to behave. It stays there, quiet, like an old photograph you don't want to erase. But you also don't need to look at every day. Over time, longing becomes memory, and memory, when well healed, becomes strength. Many people think a new beginning comes with smiles and blue skies, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it comes with a quiet house and a dinner made just for one. It comes with the certainty that no one will ask how your day was. And yet, you sit down, eat slowly, wash the dishes, and carry on. Because, even without applause, your life remains valuable. What no one tells you is that growing up hurts at any age. It hurts to admit that we've given up too much of ourselves. It hurts to recognize that the one you loved most may never have seen you the way you hoped. But after this pain subsides, comes a clarity that's uniquely yours. A certainty that doesn't need explaining. And it's with this certainty that you learn to smile differently, to wake up feeling lighter, to choose more carefully who deserves to be around. Today, I have new friends, new habits, and new routine, but I still have the same calloused hands, the same attentive eyes, the same soul that once waited too long. The difference is that now I don't wait. I offer myself when I want. I withdraw when I need to. I listen to myself first. And this freedom, despite the price, is worth every penny of the peace I carry. Because it's not about cutting ties with hate. It's about letting go with awareness. It's about stopping insisting on doors that only open from the inside out. And, when you understand this, you also understand that living in peace with your own truth is more important than any reconciliation that forces you to forget yourself again. If you've also chosen peace, even knowing it would come with longing, write here in the comments, freedom with silence. Life has curious ways of teaching us what we spend years trying to understand. Sometimes, it's only when the house is empty, the phone is silent, and our hearts are free of expectations that the lessons fall into place, like pieces of an ancient puzzle. And there, amidst this calm, full of truths, I began to understand what, for a long time, I had only survived by feeling. Because there's a kind of pain that comes with love, the kind born of excessive surrender, of giving without measure, of the hope that the other person will see what you give, even without asking for anything in return. For years, I planted a presence. I was there for them every moment, in the falls, in the triumphs, in the difficult days, and in the seemingly trivial ones. I was the ground, the lap, the advice, the silence, and what I received, often, was indifference. The hidden truth, which I struggled to see, is that there are people who mistake sweetness for weakness, who think we'll never change because we've always been there, available, constant, predictable. But even the most solid of affections wears thin when pushed too far into the corner. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see the same wrinkles, the same tired eyes, but a different glow. It's not the glow of someone who won a war. It's the glow of someone who gave up fighting the wrong battle. Of someone who understood that the greatest act of self-love is to stop dwelling on places where your soul shrinks. There's no screaming, no resentment, no punishment. There's only awareness. The awareness that life is too short to be lived in waiting mode, waiting to be seen, waiting for recognition, waiting for a change that only comes when the other wants it or never comes at all. We don't need that to move on. What we need is courage. The courage to stop begging for emotional crumbs and, instead, build a table where we can serve ourselves with dignity every day. I built this table with what was left of me, with what I recovered along the way, with what I discovered alone in the early mornings when everything hurt the most. I didn't need much. A little silence, a pinch of truth, a thread of hope, and the decision to never leave myself last again. That's how I found my strength again. Not the noisy, clenched fist, tense fist strength, but the strength that remains, even when no one is looking. The strength that gets you out of bed, even when no one needs you. The strength that smiles to itself, because, finally, it understands its own worth. If I could leave something written down today for those going through similar stories, it would be this: those who sow abandonment reap distance, but those who sow themselves with love, even after being uprooted from many soils, flourish. And they flourish alone, yes, but whole, with deep roots in all they've learned, with strong branches that no longer bend with every wind. And if someone ever asks me what saved me, the answer won't be anyone. It was time. It was silence. It was awareness. It was the act of stopping waiting for something to come back and starting to cultivate presence in myself, for myself, because that's the only place where, truly, I've never been left. If you also learned to bloom on your own, right here in the comments, I planted myself with love. If you've made it this far, it's because, somehow, this story spoke to you. And that creates a connection between us that words alone can't explain. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel, not out of obligation, but because this space is made for people who feel, who live, who think, and who rethink their own journey with courage and truth. If this video made you stop, reflect, or even remember someone, leave a like. This shows that this conversation has value and helps this type of content continue to touch other stories out there. And tell me in the comments, right, this message was for me if you stayed until the end, because knowing that you were here with me makes all the difference. And look, there's a video here on the side that complements everything we've experienced together now. Click and stay with me there, because this exchange still has a lot to grow.